All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here for this session. My name is Melissa Cuba, and I'm an assistant professor of special education at the University of Maine. I'm here to talk about centering the linguistic repertoires of multilingual learners and with disabilities, as well as their families, through translanguaging pedagogy. In this session, our goals are for you to understand what translanguaging is as a stance, also to explore its role in specifically IEPs, and to engage in reflection in this work. All right. Well, before I get to talking about translanguaging, I just want to share a little bit about myself. I was a former what we call English for speakers of other languages, right? Teacher. So ESOL, or sometimes it's called ESL, English as a second language, and special education. I took on this role and worked to support my district in developing a program to best serve and identify multilingual learners. I also come as a scholar who was a former multilingual learner. I'm originally from Peru and experienced challenges as a young multilingual learner in the United States, specifically in Virginia. So I draw from that experiential knowledge and my work of almost more than 2 decades, both in K-12 and higher ed, as a scholar in this interdisciplinary intersectional work of multilingual education and special education. Now, I do come with that language acquisition lens first, given my training and experience working with this population. So I come at this work a little differently. All right. I speak multiple languages, home languages, and languages that I've learned by living in different countries and being in different spaces. So to get us started, I just want to set the stage and provide some context and background related to translanguaging. First, I want to provide a definition for what this is. Translanguaging is the fluid use of a student's full linguistic repertoire, all of their languages, be it home languages, dialects, indigenous languages, tribal languages, regional languages. There's so many, and many of our students come with several languages, given their experiential, knowledge of being in different contexts. For example, many of the students that I'm working with are refugees, or teachers work with students who are refugees, and so these students are picking up languages as they are living in different settings. And so what we mean is they're using their full linguistic repertoire without having to separate their languages into these fixed categories. Ofelia Garcia provides us a definition for this. Translanguaging is the process by which multilingual speakers use their languages as an integrated communication system. So translanguaging, the student is not deliberately choosing to split from one language to another based on formality or audience expectations. And I think sometimes we refer to that as code switching, which means that I'm reading a code, which would mean that socially this is not acceptable. It's not acceptable for me to use all of my languages. I must choose one, and then I switch. So 2 very different things. We're not talking about code switching. We're talking about bringing all of yourself, all of your languages, and being able to use all of that repertoire and knowledge and skill in any educational context. And they're drawing from their full repertoire, which could be blending of 2 languages. One example I have is Spanglish, for example. I speak Spanglish because my home languages are Spanish, and my family is of indigenous background, so we also speak Quechua. Peru has several indigenous languages, which you'll all learn about for the conference next year. So it's a strategic and expressive and identity-affirming stance. There's no mental separation where this is English and this is the other language. It's just language as they live it, right? And so as we do this work, I'd like to think about, or all of us to think about, how IEPs often ignore these language integration practices. So what if we design them with them in mind rather than around them or excluding them? Translanguaging is also a political and decolonial position in that we see here from Garcia and Lin's work that they argue that translanguaging is not just a pedagogical tool. It's a political act that challenges monolingual ideologies in schools. It also rejects the idea that English or any dominant language is the only valid academic language, which we know isn't true. It also validates the everyday language practices of racially, linguistically, and culturally minoritized students. Also drawing from other scholars' work, we have the work of Dr. Coy Peña. Here we have two quotes. On the left being Garcia Lin's quote on how translanguaging disrupts power structures that keep language practices of minoritized communities invisible or marginalized. Dr. Coy Peña extends that work by really framing translanguaging through this decolonial lens, by connecting it to the historical silencing of multilingual learners who are disabled students in special education. So thinking about the historical silencing of languages. Dr. Coy Peña's work here, I have a quote. Translanguaging and UDL, Universal Design for Learning, disrupts ableist and monolingual systems by recognizing that inclusion means building with, not for, disabled multilingual students. So there is a need to center their lived experiences rather than forcing them to conform to these deficit-based norms. And so we're creating educational spaces where families can bring all of themselves into any setting, and we're accepting, affirming, and providing systems that support this. As I think about this work, I can't help but want to extend it into the IEP, or the Individualized Education Program, how it could be reimagined through translanguaging, this stance, these practices. When we apply a translanguaging lens, we don't just add in language considerations to the IEP, we fundamentally reimagine how we define student strengths, set their goals, and offer supports for these students. And so there are three IEP components I'd like to focus on. The first is present levels of performance. Right? And thinking through this translanguaging lens, we want to center their multilingual practices. What this could look like, right? We're thinking about present levels of performance. We know these are often English-only snapshots. But for a multilingual student, that's a very small component of who they are and what they bring to school. With translanguaging, it includes strengths of all languages based on family input and also community data. So for example, if a child helps grandma with online banking in Spanish, let's say, that's digital literacy too, right? We need to think about all these facets of language skill, ability, as we're using asset-based practices and lenses in our work. So one strategy or example of what this could look like is to use language inventories as well as interviewing families and collecting that rich data, which is so important, to include home language use, literacy behaviors at the home, and there are different home languages, and also drawing from that sociocultural context, which we know is so important. Another component of the IEP that it would be valuable for us to consider would be goals and objectives, where students can bring their full linguistic repertoires to school, their classes, and the development of documents that inform the practices and supports that we provide. So thinking about goals and objectives, right, instead of focusing on fixing English, which we should never focus on, we want to develop goals that expand capacity across all languages, right? We're building on, we're using asset-based approaches, we're using that foundation, language foundation that's so rich to extend the work that we do. This could be, right, for example, given a familiar topic, a student will write a paragraph using 2 languages, right? Let's say, again, drawing from that English and Spanish, thinking about using those word banks with key vocabulary in both languages. So for that to be implemented in the IEP, our strategy example would be to write goals that build on both English and home language strengths, using these multi-language academic targets. Another part of the IEP that could be reimagined would be services and supports, where we embrace dual language materials, we use culturally relevant prompts, so we're providing the materials and supports necessary for this to happen. And so the translanguaging lens for this would be culturally sustaining scaffolds. An example of what this strategy could look like would be to provide bilingual materials, allow for partners in the class with peer language partners to build on their home language strengths, and allow students to respond in multiple languages. All right, so I created this handout for you all to bring theory to practice, where it really centers, where we have an IEP that centers multilingualism. Please open the QR code. Unfortunately, I can't access the document because of some technology issues, but I'd like to just kind of touch on a few points. At the top, or the first page, you will see some examples of what this could look like as you think about the development of IEPs that bring this stance and lens that's so important for our students who are multilingual. And so we want, in this example, to allow students to bring their whole linguistic selves into each goal. And I provide an example of a student with a profile, Camila, and have examples for how this could be implemented and what this could potentially look like. We want to emphasize these goals are aligned with IDEA. This is really important. I want to emphasize this to you all. They're measurable, they're observable, they're achievable, and while also being culturally and linguistically affirming. All right. Do I have a few minutes for questions? Okay. How might your IEP teams build on this kind of framework? Anyone? Yes. Yes. Yes.
reading comprehension goal, Camilla will identify the main idea to supporting details using Spanish or English responses. And on the other one, actually, it was the one that underneath it I was thinking of, using a combination of English and Spanish words. She's going to write a 5-sentence personal narrative. Mm-hmm. How do we respond to teachers who don't understand translanguaging, who don't understand and will say, but I don't speak Spanish, or I don't, you know, I'm teaching her English, or she's supposed to be. What is a appropriate and supportive response to help them understand about translanguaging and why this is an appropriate scaffold?
That's an excellent question. I would respond by saying we're using asset-based approaches to support our students. And we know that multilingual learners, their linguistic foundation is key for building and learning additional languages. So it's imperative that we provide opportunities, supports for them to practice and use all of their languages as they are developing these academic skills. Now, we know that our systems, oftentimes our systems in the US, are monolingual. That's a systems issue, right? And so there's a bigger conversation at play here of thinking about systems, more personnel and supports and training related to this, but knowing that it's important that we give students opportunities to bring all of themselves as they're practicing these skills and develop mastery in all of their languages. We want them to continue to preserve and develop their full linguistic repertoire because we know that's what's best for them. Anyone else related to maybe this case study or how you might draw from this framework for your own IEP teams? Okay. Well, in the interest of time, you know, if things were to come up later and you have questions, please bring them up. But the second page of that document provides resources, several resources, practical resources of use of translanguaging in the classroom through different activities, and articles that provide a good foundation in terms of what translanguaging is and how we could support that in the classroom. It's imperative that we talk about families and centering them in the process. We know that the family is the expert of the child's lived experiences, and the IEP must reflect that expertise. And so we must challenge this idea that families don't participate and actually ask ourselves, are we designing spaces where they can? Families are children's first educators. So they're not just participants in IEP development and implementation, but also co-constructors, right? We also know that translanguaging validates home language input as data, not just an anecdote. So there is that data piece that's really critical. And thinking about how we could do that, right? And hold families' cultural and linguistic knowledge as center and critical to the development of the IEP, and them informing the development also of goals and what we're envisioning for the student. And so if the IEP meetings or special education meetings are conducted in English only, and those documents represent only that, then there's really a power differential. There's a power imbalance that's occurring here, right? We're not seeing the whole child. We're not seeing the whole family. We're only seeing a small component of them. And that's not accurate. That's not going to support their needs, as we know that the language foundation is critical to their development of other languages, but also academic skills. And so home languages are really critical to both IEP accuracy and equity. And it's also important that we talk about systemic inclusion, not parent training, right? We often ask parents to participate, but we don't invite them to shape the IEP. And translanguaging affords us that opportunity to value their knowledge, the knowledge that they have in their languages. And so it's critical that we use this approach, this stance, as we develop the IEP, but also as we think about systems design and systems change. All right, so where do we go from here? And this could be some food for thought for you all this afternoon as I'm wrapping this up. I want you to think about a multilingual student that you've served or maybe are currently working with. In what ways did the IEP process affirm or perhaps ignore their linguistic identity? And what would you do differently? All right. Last takeaways are that translanguaging is a right, as we think about it as a stance and not a remediation. We also know that IEPs must reflect the whole child and that families are essential collaborators and co-constructors of the IEP, right? They are knowledge holders, they're co-designers, they're advocates, especially when engaged, right, in their own language. So it's imperative that we think about culturally and linguistically sustaining goals that support both access and identity, and that multilingualism is a strength to be leveraged, not a barrier, not a deficit to overcome. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. This is still working, right? Yeah. Hello, everybody. I'm Dr. Sudha Krishnan from San Jose State University. And my work is mostly in inclusion of students with extensive support needs. So I will be brief. I know that everybody has a bus to catch and somewhere to go. Let me explain to you what I discovered through my research in including students with extensive support needs. The first thing that I came across that interested me was the fact that many parents who were immigrants did not want inclusion, did not advocate for inclusion for their children. And I wondered why. This was very interesting to me because in the US, it has been the parent advocacy that has pushed for reform in the school system. It has been parent advocacy and that has pushed legal mandates on the school system. But then I found that there were a group of parents, especially immigrants, who did not push for inclusion for their children. And I am from the South Asian community, and I am a parent of a child with a disability. And so this topic became close to my heart. And that's how I started investigating disability. Disability and the experiences of immigrant parents. One of the things that I came across when I did my research was disability stigma. And this was particularly prominent in the South Asian community. Stigma is defined as something that exists when human differences are recognized and labeled, but going beyond that, the labels, the stereotypes are associated with these labels, and the labeled individuals are viewed as outsiders. This labeling results in inequity and loss of status. And then when it is internalized by the individual, it is self-stigma. They can self-stigmatize themselves by considering that they are different from others because of their disability. And so I started investigating the perceptions of disability in the South Asian community. And why is stigma important? Because research shows us that social stigma can lead to social isolation. And also it decreases the likelihood of parents seeking help for their children because of the nervousness or the anxiety of exposing that their family has a child with a disability. Research also shows that physical inclusion that we are talking about, inclusive settings, is not sufficient for inclusion. We need to go beyond physical inclusion, meaningful social inclusion, and that is important. Those are the things that motivated my study. Positionality, I already said that I am a South Asian with a child with a disability, and this influenced my research topic, it influenced the method, it influenced the questions I asked, and it influenced my reaction to the interviewees. I also did a lot of introspection on how the results of the study affected me. So it is like a reciprocal thing that I got involved in the process, and I also got affected by the study results itself. My research questions were two: in what ways do the South Asian families with children with extensive support needs experience disability stigma, and how do they respond to disability stigma? I found that the South Asian families, this was qualitative research, and I did a thematic analysis, and I found that disability is seen as an exceptionality. Families said that their families had never heard of anyone with a disability because it was never talked about. There were stories of individuals who were institutionalized, but this never people never knew what happened to those children. Disability was considered to be a misfortune. Oh no, you got a child with a disability, we are so sorry, for your loss. It was treated as a misfortune, being told that they had a curse, that they were unlucky, being told that it was a big loss for them. Disability was considered to be a maternal failure. You did something wrong. You did something wrong during your pregnancy to cause the disabled child. So the mother is to blame, and that was another prominent theme. And disability as a punishment for past actions. Because a lot of the South Asian communities believe in karma. They believed, one of the parents told me, this is a life sentence I have to serve for my actions. And so this showed me that there was this big impending theme of disability stigma that was existing in the community. And I actually identified with a lot of the experiences that the parents had gone through. How do they respond to these experiences? Some parents, they talked about social and family exclusion. They said they stopped meeting their regular friends because they were afraid of being looked down upon and judged. They cut off family ties because they did not want the news to spread. And they also cut off ties from the broader South Asian community. Forming community and friendships with other parents of disabled children. So when they looked for friendships, it was only within the organizations that had disabled children in them. They did not broaden their social network. They showed resistance to disempowering narratives, which was very promising, where many of them said that they resisted the ideas of ableism and prejudice within their community. Many of them, and this may be particular to South Asian, but I'm not sure, they took a spiritual turn where they turned to God. They sought solace in religious practices. They started reading more about the philosophy, the spiritual philosophy, and they took a very great interest in religion and how it affects them and how to deal with their children. And then this again may be typical to the South Asian community, where the parents felt intense pressure to give up their job and to stay with their children to make sure that their children excel. They had innumerable therapy services, innumerable practices with the children, trained their children from morning till night, academics and social and swimming and horse riding, everything so that they could prove to the world that their child was doing very well. And this has something to do with perhaps the South Asian community in the US having the pressure to be a model community, academically successful, and the parents reacted to the pressures in that way. When we put it together, you know, in the United States, we have a lot of research evidence that supports inclusion as beneficial for many, many outcomes, social outcomes, academic outcomes, behavioral outcomes, and we push for inclusion. There are legal mandates that say that the children have to spend 80% of their time outside the classroom, or 85% of the children have to spend time in mainstreaming. There is great advocacy, parental and other organizations' advocacy. However, for children with extensive support needs, there is a systemic resistance from the school system. Teachers are not willing to take these students into their classrooms, and inclusion remains a problem. So now, my study adds another factor for this systemic resistance, which is cultural factors. That is, the parents themselves may have certain prejudices, culturally imposed pressures, culturally imposed prejudices. I'm in no way blaming the parents, especially because I know I'm one myself. The social pressure of the stigma of disability, and they forces them or compels them not to consider inclusion for their children. And they would rather keep their children isolated in a self-contained classroom rather than expose them to the general community. And the result is that 93%, and this is the latest research, 93% of students with extensive support needs may be in segregated settings. So we're not talking about mild, moderate disabilities. Extensive support needs students, if you consider all the factors, 93% of them are still educated in segregated settings. So we need to figure out what is going on and why our students are not being included even as much as the other children with disabilities. So conclusion, families chose to isolate themselves from their extended families and broader communities, resulting in lack of support for the, social support and feelings of loneliness, stress, and helplessness. Cultural beliefs that attribute disability to karma or past actions can place a heavy psychological burden on parents, especially mothers, leading to guilt, shame, and feelings of inadequacy. Stigmatizing views within the family are also strained. They also strained relationships, creating fractured families. There were 2 families that I interviewed where the disability had caused a divorce between parents. That is, they identified this as the cause of the divorce, and increased caregiving responsibilities for primary caregivers, often mothers without adequate support. This isolation restricted children with ESN from accessing community services, religious activities, and educational opportunities essential for their social development. And so that was a conclusion that disability stigma has a big role to play in American society within the South Asian community. And for future, I would love to investigate other communities and see if they have the same process going on where they restrict their children from going into inclusive classes. In fact, one of the parents, interestingly, this is the end, one of the parents said, I don't want the other parents, Indian parents, to know that my child has a disability. My daughter has a disability. You can understand, I will not be able to find a husband for my other daughter if people know that my first daughter has a disability. And so the stigma runs deep in the traditions of the family. The stigma runs deep in familial attitudes and cultural perspectives. And when we consider our students, even as educators, we have to consider them in this context, that maybe we have to provide greater advocacy for some of the students whose parents are resisting inclusion and advocacy. I think that's it. So any questions? This is my contact information. If you want to know more about me or my work, please contact me. And I don't know if the situation is the same in Kenya, but there is a lot of stigma. Yeah? Maybe.
If you can do a research in Kenya, I think it would be the perfect. Yeah, you can come, because I've also gone through the same thing, so I know how that goes. So if you ever you want to do something in Africa, you could start here. I know there are different areas that you can go into and do that research. So it would be so good to compare the two, the West and Kenya as well. So it would be so good to, yeah. So thank you for your presentation.
I have your number, so.
Yeah, I'll try and look for people that you can connect with.
Yes, I will connect with you for sure. Yeah. Yes, I think that is the future of, yeah.
Exactly.
Because we have to change the perceptions of people if we want any meaningful inclusion to take place.
Yeah, and
right?
also it comes, you start with education.
Yes.
In educating the community, and
Yes.
also as well as give the community psychosocial support first.
Right.
Because that's the one thing that they don't have. I was telling somebody earlier that no parent has a manual of how raising a child.
Yeah.
And mostly a child with disability, so that one is more difficult. So if we start from psychosocial support,
Yes.
then we move forward now making them understand
Yes.
disability is nothing.
Right.
It's just
It's
not this-
a spectrum of normal human behavior. Not
Exactly,
it should not be an exceptionality,
Yeah,
right?
'cause at the end
We
of the
should
day-
see more of them outside, right? That-
yeah, because they're human at the end of the day. So that
Yes.
would be great if you can do such a research here.
Done. I will contact you. Thank you.
Confirm kwanza bwana, ndio tuende turudi. Kwa hivyo umeenda kukutana